Welcome. Tonight is Webinar Wednesday. Thank you all for joining us tonight for this special Webinar Wednesday. Tonight we're going to focus on generics and biosimilars, all the facts that you want to know. We're going to sort through that fact from fiction and really give you guys all the knowledge you need around this. Tonight's webinar series is brought to you by CanDo MS. My name is Krista Sipp, and I am the Director of Programs here at CanDo. So again, thanks for joining us tonight. I'd also like to thank our generous sponsors for supporting this program. Thanks to Sandoz for their support of tonight's special webinar. And lastly, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers tonight. So welcome, ladies. Thank you all for joining us. Tonight we have Dr. Roz Kalb, who's a psychologist, certified health coach, and is a lead senior programs consultant here at CanDo MS. Welcome, Roz. She'll be moderating tonight's conversation with Dr. Nancy Sicott this evening and Barry Talenti. Nancy is a neurologist and director of MS and neuroimmunology at the neuroimmunology program at Cedars-Sinai. And then Barry is the executive vice president of advocacy and healthcare access at the National MS Society. So thank you all for joining us. Now I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to you ladies to talk about generics and biosimilars tonight.
Thanks so much, Krista. I'm really honored to be here with Barry and Nancy. And what I want to do is start by helping all of you in the audience understand why we invited Barry and Nancy to do this program with us, because they come at this subject from very different but very important perspectives. So I'm actually going to start with Nancy, because in some ways your role is the more familiar of the two. So Nancy, what is your interest in this topic?
Well, thank you, Roz. It's so great to be here, and I'm so excited to be sharing this event with one of my favorite people from the National MS Society, Barry, who knows all things about policy, and you'll see how smart she is and how fun it is to be together. So I'm a practicing neurologist. I am an MS specialist, if you will. I see mainly patients who live with MS and other demyelinating disorders. And I've been doing this now for 25 years. So I have a very specific perspective about in particular, the disease modifying therapies, because that's been the huge change during the time that I've been practicing. And so I spend a lot of time working with patients, trying to get them on the appropriate therapies for disease management and for also symptom management and so forth. But it's become increasingly complex, and we do spend a lot of time navigating our somewhat frustrating medical system, which I'm sure all of the people who live with MS have experienced. So I come at this with, it's a constantly changing landscape and confusing for all of us. So I'm grateful that we'll have this opportunity, hopefully, to clarify some of these issues for our listeners and for our patients, but also for ourselves, because I know Barry's going to teach us some things too. So happy to be here.
Okay, now you're on the spot, Barry. So can you describe your passion and your expertise and where they come from?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I've already learned something from Nancy tonight, so I know everyone on the call tonight will too. So I'm really focused on making sure that our healthcare system doesn't get in the way for people with MS and getting the treatments that they need. And so it's really thinking about how all the different players in the healthcare system interact, what may be getting in the way of people getting the medications that they rely on. And that's both, access, affordability is a big part of that. And we'll talk about that tonight. Navigating through the healthcare system, all of those pieces really factor into making sure people can get on the disease modifying treatment that's right for them. And the disease modifying treatments are very expensive. So we have to be able to talk about affordability and understand generics and biosimilars and the role that they play both in access, but then in the affordability piece overall.
So if we put all this together for all of you who are listening, you're seeing both ends of the process, right? The neurologist who may help you choose the best medication for you. But then you have Barry and the National MS Society and other people in advocacy trying to make sure that once a provider and a patient have worked together to identify a treatment, there aren't a lot of roadblocks to getting that treatment. So let's talk about this a little bit more. So Barry, in the MS world recently, we're hearing a lot of new terms that weren't there when I first started a while ago. We're hearing generics, we're hearing biosimilars much more often. Can you just start by helping us understand what those terms mean? And I think we're going to have a magic glossary to put up to help us get started with this conversation.
Yeah, and it does get really complicated and complex. So, first, the good news in MS, right, is that we have more than 20 disease-modifying treatments that are available for people with relapsing forms of MS. And that's important to call out because as we go through the conversation today, we'll be talking about sort of we want to protect innovation and reward research and make sure that we keep working towards finding new solutions for people with MS. And so that's, the what you see on the screen as a pharmaceutical drug, sometimes also called a reference product, but those are sort of the original innovative products that have gone through a really detailed years, sometimes decades long research and development process. And so when those products are brought to market, they're approved by the FDA, which Nancy will talk about. They come to market, which means that's when your healthcare provider can prescribe it for you and you can get the medication. And then there's things that protect those products to be able to recoup the cost because it is really expensive to bring these innovative products to market. And so there's patents and exclusivity that we'll talk about a little bit later that really protect that innovation and let pharmaceutical companies recoup the costs of their investment. And then like any
Before
other
you
products, yeah.
before you move on, Barry, let me just ask you to clarify one thing. You mentioned relapsing forms of MS, that these pharmaceutical drugs are approved to treat. Can you just quickly remind people what's included in relapsing forms of MS?
Yes, and Nancy will jump in if I get it wrong. But relapsing forms of MS, as the FDA has described it, includes clinically isolated syndrome, sort of relapsing remitting MS, and active secondary progressive MS. So anything where you still have those relapses, sort of those ebbs and flows and inflammation comes under that relapsing forms of MS.
Awesome. Thank you.
And
Yeah,
I will just
absolutely.
add one little piece of that. That includes activity on MRI in the absence of relapse. So we call that just active. You can have active secondary progressive MS, for example, or progressive MS if you're having activity, and that would make you eligible for treatment.
Great.
Awesome.
Thanks, Nancy. So, like any products that we're familiar with, sort of products have a life cycle. So, if you think about this is why your Apple iPhone doesn't last very long and you're always getting a new one because there's a natural life cycle to products. And so, the patents and exclusivity that I mentioned, they help with that life cycle for a pharmaceutical product. And as that life cycle is nearing its end, where we think policy wise that companies have recouped their investment for innovation, then that protection ends, and we see that other companies can come in and bring generics and biosimilars to market. And so that's some background as we talk about some of these terms that we see on the screen. So pharmaceutical drug, reference drug, originator product. Those are all brand products. Those are all sort of the same thing. It's that original innovative product that's been brought forward to market. A pharmaceutical drug is sometimes called a small compound. It has a chemical process to make the drug. And an easy way to think about it for someone like me who's not a science person is that these are generally the pills that you take, right? So the DMTs that are pills, those generally go through this chemical process. In MS and our DMTs, we also have a lot of biologics, which are larger, complex molecules. They're manufactured from living systems. And these, in my sort of shorthand, are self-injectables or infused products. So they're more complicated. They have some more complicated forms of administration, and they're called biologics. So a generic is a follow-on medication that you see here. It contains the same active ingredients, and a generic is for that chemical product. So the generic goes with the pharmaceutical drug, and a biosimilar goes with the biologic. Biosimilar kind of feels like a funny name, and it's because the biologic is complex and made from a living system that you can't get something that's identical like you can through a chemical process. And that's where we get biosimilar. But Nancy will talk about sort of how we know that generics and biosimilars are really the same as the reference products, but there's processes that they have to go through the FDA based on the active ingredients in the medications. And so that sort of goes through the different things that we see here on the screen. I'll say sometimes generics or biosimilars can feel a little scary, especially as we're thinking about our disease modifying treatments that so many people rely on. But we really are used to generics in our everyday life. So if you think about sort of Advil that you take for a headache, you're also often taking ibuprofen, which is the generic for the Advil. So it helps to sometimes think about what else in our lives really fits these same descriptions, but we just may not know the labels to put to them. So this slide talks a little bit about the differences between generics and biosimilars. Again, it's sort of how the products are made, the living sources versus chemicals. And then, based on that, the biosimilars are more complicated to produce. And then, you know, overall, biosimilars and generics are faster to develop than those originator products that are sort of paving the way through clinical trials to make sure that the drugs are efficacious and safe and really work the way we want them to treat the conditions that we're looking at. And then, as we'll get into later tonight, these are usually less expensive than the brand name products, both for generics and biosimilars. So this slide just really has a look at the biologic versus biosimilar. And so the biologic, again, it's that new innovator product. It can take up to 15 years to develop. That's that lengthy process to make sure that it works. It's very expensive to develop. And because it is that innovation that we reward, it's patentable. That means it can have a patent to protect it, to be able to recoup costs. And the biosimilar is nearly identical, so that's similar term. And it, like the biologic, it's made from that living source. It has a shorter time frame to develop, which also makes it less expensive. And it doesn't have patents attached to it because it's not an innovative product. It's following on to the biologic and learning from what the biologic did in the market and in the development process.
So this is a lot for all of us to get our heads around. But so let's turn to Nancy, our practicing neurologist. Could you please first just identify for all of us which medications currently have a generic, which of those original drugs have a generic, and which have a biosimilar attached?
Happy to do that. And thank you, Barry, for that detailed description. It is complicated and confusing for folks, but I think the ibuprofen example is a really good one when you think about generics. So when we look at what's available for the MS community, so what's also interesting is there's more than one for some of these medications. So if you look at Copaxone, there's a generic that's called glatiramer acetate. There's another version that is Glatopa. So these are all been deemed to be similar to the Copaxone product, and they are available as generics. And so one of the other themes that we haven't really gotten into is this idea of when do you get a generic? Do you have the ability to choose a generic? And sometimes this decision is made for you, based in part on your insurance. In the state of California, there was a law that was passed that if there was a generic equivalent available for a medication, that there was a requirement that the physician actually prescribe it. So, in an attempt to, and I don't think this is the case across the country, and there may be different in different states, but it's an example of, trying really hard to control drug costs, with this notion that the generic treatments are going to be less expensive. So that is true potentially for the insurance companies. But as we will talk about perhaps a little bit later, it's not always true for the individual patient. And this is a little bit of the perversion of the system in terms of what the incentives are for the prescribing physician as well as for the patients. But just to continue here for the generics, an oral medication, Gilenya, there is a generic available, which is fingolimod. Tecfidera, there's which is dimethyl fumarate. There are, I think, a couple of versions of dimethyl fumarate generics. And then Aubagio is also available as a generic, also known as teriflutamide. So I'll also, just as an aside, say, when we were training, as first coming out of medical school, we always learned the medications by their trade name. So Copaxone, Gilenya, Tecfidera, Aubagio. The medical schools have made a real effort to teach the medical students to use the generic name of the medication. And this, I think, is really helpful because you're thinking about the medication itself, not the particular brand of that. So that would be the difference between I'm going to be prescribing ibuprofen, not Advil, because we know there's lots of different versions of ibuprofen. So the medical students, it's a sign of being an old doc that we still use the trade names, but all of the students are taught to use the generic names, which I think is good.
So I have a question though,
Yeah.
for you, Nancy, because one of the things that may be confusing to people here is if you notice on the chart, Copaxone, Gilenya, Tecfidera, Aubagio, and Tysabri all have a registered trademark next to their name, which for some people is the kind of dead giveaway that it's the original product. But now some of the generics have brand names and trademarks associated with them, but that does not mean that they're not generics, and it does not mean that they're different from other generic products, correct?
It means that they've registered that name for that generic, and because there are now different companies that are making these, and so that can play a role if you, again, to get into the minutia of the medical system, that your particular insurance company may have a contract or may have a formulary where they've worked with particular pharmaceutical companies to get certain versions of these drugs. And so that's why it would be important to differentiate
Yeah.
who is making them, because different companies now, it's kind of wide open. So different companies can make their own version of the generic drug. I don't know, Barry, if you want to put more color on that.
No, I think you handled that really well, Nancy. There's some branded generics, and it doesn't mean anything other than it's a branded generic.
Just to be
And
confusing.
And
Yes.
somebody has asked a couple times about Ocrevus. Now, just to
yeah, happy to
clarify,
talk
the
about that.
drugs that are on that chart that you just saw are the ones that either have a generic associated with them or a biosimilar. So ocrelizumab and Ocrevus are the brand name and the generic name of that drug, but there is no generic on the market.
Version of ocrelizumab. That is absolutely the case. Now, there is what we call a class of drugs So again, especially for the biologics, as Barry was saying, these are complicated compounds that are made in cells. They're proteins. They have a complex structure. Many of these are monoclonal antibodies. So they are made in little cellular factories, if you will. There's a bunch of cells. They have a piece of genetic material inserted in them that keeps just chunking out these versions of these antibodies, and they're all the same. That's why they're monoclonal. They're all the same. So those have a particular structure. So depending on what that little gene is that you've put into the cell, it can be slightly different. So the first of these, but the monoclonal antibody itself has a very similar biological effect. So let's talk about Ocrevus and the class of medications that are called B cell depleters, because this, I think, illustrates this point. So one of the first B cell depleters available was rituximab, also known as Rituxan. And that is what we call a chimeric molecule. It's part mouse and part human. So the gene that got put into the cell, and Roz, you're making a bad face. The gene that got put into the cell spits out a version of this anti-CD20 monoclonal antibody that has a piece of it in it that came from a mouse. And so the versions that you can modify the versions now, change the gene slightly so they have less mouse or they're slightly different. But when you put those antibodies into the body, they have the same effect. So they all work by attaching to something that's on the outside of B cells, so the CD20 marker, and that tags the cell for destruction. And so when you, at the end of the day, when you draw the blood after any of these therapies that deplete B cells, you see that the B cells are gone. So the biological effect is the same, but the molecules are slightly different.
So, sorry, but I want to make sure that we get to the two big questions that are on people's minds.
Yeah.
One is, how do these medications differ, right? If you take a generic or you take the reference drug or you take a biosimilar, from your perspective as a neurologist, how do they differ for the patient?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the B cell depleters, there are a bunch of different ones, are not the same as each other. But a biosimilar would take one of those B cell depleters. So let's talk about rituximab. Rituximab actually has a biosimilar called Ruxence. Am I saying that right? Ruxience. So that is exactly the same as rituximab, and that is a biosimilar. So it is chemically similar to what the Rituxan would do. Now, as I said, Rituxan is slightly different from ocrelizumab, which is slightly different from another B cell depleter called Kesimpta or ofatumumab, which is also given under the skin rather than an infusion. But at the end of the day, the biosimilars and the generics have to show, the FDA has to see evidence that they are having the same identical effect on the body as the reference, the first drug, the reference compound. That's really the key. So the medications have to be essentially the same in terms of their effects. So I'm afraid I may have confused people by talking too much about the different B cell depleters, but those are just to show you why Ocrevus doesn't have a biosimilar yet. But there's many ways to skin the cat in terms of depleting B cells. I think that what I tell my patients when we're talking about these drugs is generics and biosimilars are doing the same thing as the original medication. That's what's required by the FDA in order to be approved as a generic or as a biosimilar. They have to prove to the FDA that by doing a variety of tests, they have to show purity, they have to show potency, and they have to show safety, The one thing that they don't have to do is do a 5-year clinical trial that costs hundreds of millions of dollars in order to show the effect in patients, because they're able to show those other measures that correlate with the effects when they did the bigger clinical trials. So they already have a lot of information from the original therapy. And so now they can use what we would call biomarkers that show that the new version is doing exactly the same thing biologically without having to put people through a long clinical trial. And that's why when Barry was showing that slide with the cost of the medications, it's a lot cheaper to get these biosimilars and generics approved because you don't have to go through years of human trials.
So that begs a question, and this goes to Barry. So if they're equivalent, why would anybody switch, right?
Right. And so the biggest reason is cost. And, Nancy alluded to this earlier. Sometimes it's not up to individual patients around which version of a medication they get. Sometimes that is decided by your health insurer or your pharmacy benefit manager who manages the prescription drug portfolio on behalf of your health insurer. So for individuals, that comes across in your formulary. So you may say this, you may hear this isn't on your formulary, or that, well, the generic is preferred for you. So that's a fancy way of saying that's the medication that your health insurer says you should be taking first, right? But the bottom line is the difference in cost to them. So there's a big savings to the healthcare system overall from using generics or biosimilars. What we have on the screen, and I know some of the numbers are really small, is it's just an example of one of the medications. So this is for fingolimod, which is the brand is Gilenya. And so you're looking at the price differences between Gilenya and the different generics. So remember, Nancy said that there's multiple generics for a brand product. So we start with one generic that comes on the market, and that usually is priced at about 15% less. And so if you look at the line charts over to the left, that blue line at the top is the price over time of Gilenya. So it's, as you can see, it's now up to about $129,000. So that orange line that's right under it was the first generic fingolimod that got approved by the FDA. And so it was almost what we call a textbook 15% less in price. And then once more generics came on market, that's the competitive pressure that we see that pushes the prices down. So now if you look at that chart on the right, where it's easier to see the numbers, again, the originator product is well over $120,000. And then the various generics range from, what do we have there, from about $3,000 up to about $27,000. So even the more expensive generics are significantly about $100,000 less than the brand product. Now, you also don't get to decide which generic you take, which of these generics. That is an agreement between your health insurer and the pharmacies that they contract with, or the pharmacy that you go to pick up your medication. So that the pharmacy is sort of deciding which generic it purchases, and you just know that you're taking fingolimod. You look like you
So
have a question, Roz.
yeah, well, I have a couple of follow-up questions. So one is if you're just starting out, right, you're newly diagnosed, you get prescribed a medication, you've never been on anything else before. And it may be that your insurance company assigns you a particular generic. And so you go with that, and you and your doctor stick with that as long as it's doing what we want it to do. If you've been on a brand name and suddenly your insurance company switches you to a generic or to a biosimilar, I know that people have concerns about rocking the boat, right? So Nancy, in your experience, when people move from a brand name they've been doing well on to a generic or a biosimilar, does the boat in fact rock?
So it's a great question, and I was looking through the chat, and I see that there are some people who have mentioned some experiences they've had when they were switched to generic medications. But in general, my experience is that we don't see any difference. Now, the good news is that we will monitor patients very closely. I mean, we monitor them closely anyway, but we will continue to monitor both clinically, radiographically, and then also lab tests. There are some lab tests that can be helpful in terms of seeing the effect of the medication, and as I said, in particular, looking at B cell depleters. But in general, we don't see any difference in efficacy between the medications when they've switched. And I think, Raz, you make a good point. Especially for the oral medicines, you may get a different manufacturer every time you fill your medication. So it's still the same drug. It's just being made by a different manufacturer, but the same FDA requirements of purity and potency exist. So I think there was in the initial stages when generics started to come on the market for all sorts of things, there was this sort of anxiety, and I think in particular for MS patients, is feeling like I'm doing well. I really don't want to change anything.
Right.
And I think that's in our patient population really common. So my sense and my advice is that it's not a typical effect of doing a switch, and that we're monitoring anyway for those things. And if it happened that there would seem to be a relationship between switching from one product to another, there's the ability to remedy that by either switching to something else or making a case to go back onto the brand formulation. And we do that sometimes. I will say there are some people who feel that the brand, for example, of Copaxone is superior to the other generic forms of it. It's hard to prove in terms of how they feel about it, but people can have experiences where they feel like they have more difficulties with the other versions. And we can make a case for that, but that's rare. I would say that's very, very uncommon. And most people switch to generics without any issues at all. But it is something to have a discussion when it's coming up because it is a concern for people.
So Barry, back to you for a second, because the fact that the prices dropped so much in your example is really exciting, right? It's exciting for the healthcare system. It's exciting for the patient population that this is true. But for the individual person, some people will find that their out-of-pocket costs don't actually change. So can you explain how that might happen and if there's any workaround when that happens?
Yeah, and that's really frustrating, right? I mean, look how much lower these prices are. It should be reflected for individual patients.
Right.
So there's a few things that are happening with that. So one is, remember I talked about those formularies and medications may sit on a different tier within the formulary. And so, you know, the way a formulary should work is that there's a generic tier where you pay not very much at all. It used to be sort of a $5 copay for any generic that you took. Then there's what they call a preferred brand tier. So brand medications that the health insurers know lots of people use and that there's not other options for them. And then there would be a non-preferred brand tier where maybe something else is available, right? If you think in the MS space, I always describe Tecfidera and Vumerity as cousins, right? They're both fumarate products, so there's a lot of similarity in how they work. So that would be an example where one might be a preferred medication and the other would be a non-preferred because there's something else that's very similar that's available. And the higher up you go in that formulary tiers, the the higher someone's out-of-pocket costs are. And then, many years ago, we got added on another tier that's called a specialty tier. And that's where the MS disease modifying treatments sit most of the time. And like all expensive medications sit on that specialty tier. And the really horrible thing about being on that specialty tier is that instead of that flat copay that maybe it's $5, maybe it's 50, maybe 100, usually when you're on that specialty tier, it's actually what's called coinsurance. And coinsurance means it's a percentage of the price of the medication. And so that's where we get into the place where someone's monthly out-of-pocket costs could be 500, 800, even $1,000 or more because you're paying a percentage of the price of the medication. Now, what we see with the generics that have come for MS is that even though they're so much lower, they're still often put on a specialty tier. And so someone may still be paying a percent of the price of the medications. And while they're by far lower priced than the brand products, they're still expensive, right? They're still 5,000, 10,000, maybe more. So that coinsurance still adds up rather quickly. The other thing that we've seen is that many people, because the MS DMTs are so expensive, many people rely on assistance from pharmaceutical companies. And so when you're on a product like Tecfidera, you are able to get financial assistance or pharmaceutical assistance, it's sometimes called, from the brand name pharmaceutical company. And that lowers your out-of-pocket cost tremendously, or maybe it's even zero. When we have generic products, most generic companies do not provide that same level of patient assistance. Oftentimes, they don't provide assistance at all. And you can see from a business standpoint, it's because there's no way to know which generic someone is actually on. I mean, it's on your prescription bottle, but they don't know what's being prescribed. And again, their goal is to provide the medication at a much lower price. And so they're not providing that financial assistance. If there is a branded generic or the branded biosimilar, usually when something's branded, that patient assistance is available. But even we've seen when generics are available, the reference product companies will stop providing financial assistance. Again, because more and more people are being moved to the generic, and so they're just not supporting the brand's product in the same way.
So I promised Krista that we would leave plenty of time for our audience to ask questions. But Nancy, you look as though you have something you wanted to add.
Well, I
So
was going to give, again, Barry does such a lovely job explaining this, but it is also very complicated for people, unfortunately. But I do see there's it looks like we're getting a lot of good questions. I was just going to give an example to highlight what Barry was talking about in terms of these copays. So again, in California, once there was a generic for Tecfidera, dimethyl fumarate versions, the copay assist programs went away, and we had many patients who, at the turn of the year, their insurance companies said, now you have to start paying your well, they still have a copay, but they weren't getting copay assistance. And so between $250 and $500 a month, people were having to pay. What happened is Vumerity became available, and Vumerity is a brand product. So rather than keep our patients on generic medications or move them to generics where they weren't going to get the copay assist, they moved over to Vumerity. And so Vumerity is a high cost drug. Now, we don't feel happy about doing that. But for patients, then they were eligible for getting the copay assist. And so now we've continued this process of putting them on another brand product that is very expensive. And so this is what I was referring to, Barry, about the perverse incentives that are put into the system. And again, I think again in California, they're trying to get us to use the generics, but without fixing the rest of the system, it falls down into the individual patients. and they're
So,
having to
so
bear that burden.
you as a neurologist end up playing a bit of a shell game, trying to move people around for the best possible deal. So Krista, do you have some questions that you want to
I do
share?
have a few, and I think, if you guys want to bounce around answering from your different perspectives, I'd love that too. But a big question that has been coming up, well, there's a few of them, but one of the ones that I've seen a handful of times is aging. So as you're aging, are there considerations for these biosimilar and generic drugs? When you are part of that aging population, is there anything that you need to consider additionally? Is there anything specifically that's available to those populations that wouldn't, you know?
So that's a great question. I mean, aging changes metabolism. It changes the way we handle all sorts of medications, the way our people experience their MS changes as they get older. But in terms of the medications themselves, the differences between the standard brand and the generic, there wouldn't be a difference between them on this aging process. I do think it's something interesting to think about and talk to your neurologist about. Some of the medications that we use are immune suppressing, and the immune system, as you get older, becomes less responsive. So there's the good news is less inflammatory lesions, but the bad news is more susceptibility to infections. But that increased risk with aging would occur whether you want a brand product or whether you're on a generic product or a biosimilar or the original product. It's just there's no difference between that risk with those. I think that answers that question. Yeah.
And Krista, I want to jump in and address it from the cost perspective. So it gives me the opportunity to highlight a really big advocacy win that the MS community had, and really everyone who relies on expensive medications. And so starting in this January 2025, anyone on Medicare who takes outpatient prescription drugs, so that's the pills and the self-injectables, will have your out-of-pocket costs capped for prescription drugs at $2,000 a year. You also have the availability to spread those costs throughout the year in something that's called the Medicare Prescription Payment Plan. And so it's really important. I can't emphasize this enough. As we get into open enrollment for Medicare this year, if you are eligible for Medicare, which is anyone 65 and older or people who are on Medicare through disability, make sure that you're really taking a look at plan options during open enrollment, which runs from about mid-October through mid-December, because it may be completely different for you this year. You may have lots more options knowing that your out-of-pocket costs are going to be capped for any outpatient prescription drugs that you take.
Would you also recommend, Barry, that anybody switching insurance plans for whatever reason through the marketplace or any other way take the time to look into their pharmaceutical tiers to see where the drugs they are currently taking land before choosing a plan?
Yes, absolutely. If you have that option. I think often when we talk about health insurance and people are thinking about choosing a plan, we tend to focus on the monthly premiums. And that's okay, really, if you're healthy and you don't have a lot of healthcare needs. But if you have healthcare needs and rely on expensive medications or other expensive healthcare treatments, you really need to go into the plan more deeply because really where you're going to get impacted is not the monthly premium, but those out-of-pocket costs. So diving into those details is really important, like Roz says.
Awesome.
That's amazing. Thank you guys for highlighting that. That does sound like a big win, Barry. So thanks for sharing that. So next question, which we've talked a little bit about this for sure, but I just want to, bring this back up is efficacy and safety. Is there a big difference between these items when it comes to the original medication, the brand name medication, and the generics and or biosimilars?
You're
Oh,
on mute, Nancy.
I'm sorry, muted. Just to re-emphasize, those medications cannot be approved by the FDA, so they wouldn't be available in the marketplace unless they had been shown to have the same potency, efficacy, safety. So that's how they get approved. And then there's an ongoing process to monitor quality and to make sure that the product that's being made continues to meet those standards. And that's the case for the brand as well as for any of the generics. So there's a lot of regulatory oversight on pharmaceuticals, and that pertains to the generics as well. So by definition, having the generic on the market means that the FDA has looked at all of those factors and determined that there's not a problem.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Nancy. Two
Uh,
things
I, I have a question that is sort of related to all of this, but I think it's important now that we're going into the fall season. So pretty soon everybody's going to be hearing about getting their flu vaccine, getting their COVID vaccine, their RSV vaccine. So Nancy, from your perspective, is there anything people need to be aware of related to the DMT they are taking, or a conversation they need to have with their MS care provider about when to get a vaccine, if it's okay to get a vaccine, and if the vaccine is going to be as effective as it would be for somebody else?
Well, that's my bailiwick for the COVID vaccine task force. But just briefly, we definitely recommend that people get vaccinated, especially for those respiratory viruses. There is no evidence that vaccination worsens MS, but there is a lot of evidence that viral infections such as COVID, flu, and RSV can trigger relapses. So we definitely want people to get vaccinated. The two medications that have been shown to impact vaccine responses are the B cell depleters that I mentioned. So that would be Kesimpta, Rituxan, Ocrevus. The timing of when you do your infusions can determine how responsive you are to the vaccine. So we've recommended in the past that you wait 3 months after if you're doing it every 6-month infusion. Wait at least 3 months before you get your vaccination. But at the end of the day, it's more important to get your vaccination, not to wait, especially, well, out here in California, we've got tons of COVID. So we're all looking forward to having access to that. But again, that's not really a generic biosimilar issue. It's more of a health maintenance. But yes, definitely get vaccinated. And even though your antibodies may not be as potent, we do know that your T cell responses will be also are impacted in a positive way. So it's worth doing.
Thanks for that.
I'm sifting through some questions right now. Is there anything else that you guys wanted to talk about specifically tonight that we haven't talked about yet? Any questions? I know there were a few that we might not have gotten to, Roz. So
we did have a question from somebody about JC virus testing, which we used to hear about all the time. And now we don't hear about it as much, but I think it's still important for people to understand the role of JC virus testing. So Nancy, can you?
Sure. And the one biosimilar, that's now on the market is, of course, the Tysabri, the Tyruka, which is a Tysabri biosimilar. And so, as many of you know, Tysabri is a very effective monoclonal antibody treatment for MS, but has essentially one very severe side effect and risk, which is the development of a brain infection called PML. And PML can be devastating. So about half of the population has been exposed to the virus that causes PML. That's called the JC virus. And so for those of you who are on Tysabri or would be on Tyruka, there is a risk mitigation program that you would be required to have testing done at least every 6 months to make sure that your antibody titer is not increasing and is not above 1.5. In my practice, if someone becomes positive on the JC virus antibody, I take them off of Tysabri. There's also some smaller risk of developing PML in some other treatments, including fingolimod and in very, very rare cases in Tecfidera or dimethyl fumarate when lymphocyte counts drop too low for too long. So all of this is to say that when you're on these disease modifying therapies, you should be having regular visits with your neurologist and routine blood work done. In the vast majority of cases, people don't have issues with this, but we want to be able to catch these risk factors and adjust accordingly if they're present.
I want to go back to Barry for a second because I really want everybody on this program to understand the incredibly important role that the National MS Society and the advocacy team have played in advocating for access to affordable treatments. I've never known anybody to work as hard as Barry is. It's really a dog with a bone trying to make all of this work for people with MS. Is there anything now that's a particular focus of your team, Barry, that you want people to know about? Because I know you're always recruiting people to become MS advocates and sign up on the website. So what's happening right now with that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Roz. And what's happening right now is reform for pharmacy benefit managers. And so you heard Nancy and I both sort of reference the perverse incentives in the healthcare system. I said PBMs, as they're called, are sort of that middleman between a health insurer and a pharmaceutical company. I think like the really quick takeaways are there's no transparency at all. And I kind of describe it as PBMs actually have a lot of control over the medication you take, how much your out-of-pocket cost is, the barriers you and your healthcare provider have to go to get it in terms of step therapy or prior authorization that you, as a patient and as sort of the consumer of your health insurance, actually never interact with at all. So there's huge efforts right now to reform the practices of PBMs. And there's some legislation happening in various states across the country, and there's some big efforts at the federal level. And this is one of the priorities of the National MS Society before the end of the calendar year. So we had a lot of progress with the Inflation Reduction Act. We've had a lot of progress with sort of limiting the increases that prescription drugs take year over year. And now we have to go all the way through all aspects of the healthcare system to make it all work together. And PBMs are next. So you can find more information on the Society's website, find out how to be an activist. MS advocates are meeting with congressional reps throughout August, all across the country as members of Congress are sort of back home campaigning and in the August timeframe. So
This is
very
a good time to
timely.
get their ear, right?
Yes.
They all,
You can find them
all
at the
want you,
grocery store too, right? They're home in their district.
they all want you to vote for them. So this is a good time to tap them on
No,
the
the
shoulder.
That's
berries,
right.
it's so huge. There's a whole series of a whole article, maybe it's a series of articles, I think it was in the New York Times about them.
Yes.
It's so complicated and it's so perverse. And it makes your blood boil when you think about like, because we have to deal with the fallout and our patients have to deal with it. So I was looking through the questions and I wanted to just clarify about the vaccines.
Thank
So
you,
I,
Nancy.
I said the first part, which is at least 3 months, but then the question is how soon before your next infusion, does it make sense? So we like to recommend at least 2 weeks because it takes 2 weeks for your antibody responses after a vaccine, but preferably a month. So the ideal time to get a vaccine would be 5 months after your last infusion if you're on a 6-month infusion cycle. Does that make sense? So
Yep.
you wait 5 months and you should have a little bit of the B cell return, get your vaccine, and then it gives you 4 weeks for your immune system to respond to the vaccine, and then you could do your infusion. For Kesimpta, which is the injection, that's given monthly. So we are advising people just to do it after 2 weeks. So if you've done your injection, wait 2 weeks and get your vaccine. Again, it's more important to just get your vaccine than to get the timing perfect.
So just to
And
clarify, the question was, what is a PBM? That
yep.
stands for pharmacy benefits manager. And from Barry's description, there are these ghostly figures that you never see or hear who are in the middle between you and your doctor and the pharmacy, and they're wreaking havoc
They
on drug prices. So
They are.
Barry
And I
and
saw a
the team
couple of
trying to fix
questions
it.
around Mark Cuban's Cost Plus, so I know we did want to get to that. So yes, it is a resource that I do recommend. So Mark Cuban, you probably know him more as the head of the Dallas Mavericks or Shark Tank, maybe. But he is a self-described disruptor in the healthcare space and is really against PBMs. So his company, Mark Cuban's Cost Plus, is a place where you can go. They have a website to find generic medications at really inexpensive prices. And their business model is the cost of the medication plus a standard 15% markup. So completely transparent, to counteract what we were talking about with PBMs. So Cost Plus does have the DMT generics that we mentioned. They also have generics for Ampera, which I saw pop up. The important thing to note is it's a great resource. Your medications will be fairly inexpensive. It is outside of your health insurance. So that's important to know. It's sort of what's called essentially cash, but you're paying for that and it does not count against your health insurance deductible or towards your out-of-pocket maximum. So I want to make sure you understand that as you're making the decisions about the best method for you to get your medication.
Thanks
And
for
one,
jumping in there to answer that one, Barry.
one,
We're at the
we have,
top of the hour,
mm,
Roz.
okay. I just,
I'm sorry. So what I am going to say is if we didn't get to your question tonight, go ahead and email us. We can answer your questions via email. Go ahead and shoot that to info@cando-ms.org and we'll answer your questions as we're able. You can also stay connected with us through a variety of ways. You can see these here. And then I also want to mention again, thank you to Sandoz. I really appreciate you guys being here tonight. Thank you to all of our speakers for joining us and sharing your knowledge with us. So thank you all and have a great evening.
take care.